Hire slow means find people that really want to do a great job, and that really have a strong work ethic, but not that want to prove to everybody else that they're willing to sacrifice their personal life completely. Welcome to At the Table, the podcast that lives at the intersection between culture, teamwork, leadership, and organizational health. I'm your host, Pat Lencioni. This is my co-host, Cody Thompson. How you doing, Cody?
I am doing swell, Pat. Hey, excited for this conversation.
Me too. And it's the fourth time we're trying to record it because we keep messing up. So
fourth time's the charm.
What's the topic, Cody?
We're going to talk about hunger wins.
That's right. And this is something that I've been noticing in my conversation with clients and reading I'm doing and talking to various people around the world. There's a new emphasis on competitiveness. Everybody's talking about we need to get more competitive. And I don't know if that's because of all the tariff discussions and all these countries trying to do business with one another, or if it's because long corporate COVID is finally worn off and people are like, okay, everybody's back at work. We got to figure out how to be more competitive. Whatever the reason, people are talking about this across the world, in different parts of the country, in Europe. I've been talking to a lot of people. How do we get more competitive? And too often they're talking about work hours as a surrogate for competitiveness and hunger. And I just don't think that's right.
Yeah, I love when you do this, Pat, where you're sort of surveying the business landscape. You're hearing conversations from leaders, and then what they're saying and the solutions that they think they're going to kind of entertain are kind of antithetical to the way, like even our own philosophy about business. So often we're talking about efficiency versus effectiveness and what is hunger and what do work hours have to do with production and productivity. And so I love when we have these sort of, philosophical arguments around this, and we get to be grounded in sort of our way of looking at the world of work. And so I'm excited to dive in.
Cody, how this came about as a guy in Europe, a venture capitalist, wrote an article recently, and he said that until Europe's startup community adopts the same work ethic as China and the Silicon Valley in California, that they're never going to be able to compete. And what he did is he said, like in China, they have this thing called the 996 model, which is you work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And in case you don't want to do the math, that's 72 hours. And I think that is so ridiculous and I worked those hours. My first job out of college was with a management consulting firm, and they just worked us to death. And I can say from firsthand experience, that was not a good indicator of hunger. We got to the point where it just became something to complain about, and we tried to game the system by making it look like we worked harder. And we spent a lot of hours just at work doing non-productive things. And so I want to talk about what real competitiveness work looks like and how to create a workforce of hungry people that aren't trying to prove it by the number of hours they spend in the office, but that it's actually about ownership and passion. And Cody, before we go further, I just want to say, I'm certainly not one of those people, though, that's an advocate for like, oh, we shouldn't push people. It's all about work-life balance in kind of a soft way. I don't believe in that at all. And when people after COVID said, we were just as productive when we worked at home, I call BS on that. Mm-hmm. I think you were more productive if you didn't want to commute and put on pants every day. But generally speaking, people working from home, and I was one of them for a while, that was not really a competitive landscape. And so let's talk about how to make a competitive, hungry workforce without doing things that are ridiculously slavish in terms of how we treat our employees.
Yeah, I like the two words, Pat, the competitive and hunger. And what do we mean by those? And what is it actually when you can create a culture that's like that? It's sort of like sort of backing your way into what you think will make you competitive is like more work hours, right? Is that really going to be the thing? I heard one CEO that was a client of ours say, hey, if you spend 10 years in the third grade, it doesn't mean you're good at the third grade, And so it's like more time at work is not necessarily the solution here. What is it how do we think about this? If competitive workforce is the key, is more hours the lever for you to pull to try to get there? And I think it's pretty antithetical to what we think in terms of pushing people around hunger.
And ironically, it's a lazy way to do it. It's like, oh,
Right.
let's just make people work more hours. There's a lot more nuance in this. Now, let me just be clear. I'm not saying that people that are competitive and work hard and have passion aren't going to work long hours sometimes. There's going to be moments in their lives when customers need something or there's something going on when you've got to pull a lot of really late nights. That's just part of answering the call, but that should not be the regular thing. And companies that turn that into the regular thing actually just burn people out. And it's interesting because people stop working smarter and they stop trying to figure things out and they just figure, well, I'm going to be here for the next 80 hours anyway. I'll just kind of keep plugging along. So the thing I want to say is I'm really glad that the world has woken up to this. I think it's really good that people in different parts of the world are saying, we don't want to slack anymore. And there's reasons why they're doing that. And I think it's worth putting those out there. For years, I did a lot of work in Europe, and it was impossible to get people to work longer. And it was impossible to hire slackers. And I knew this from the people that ran the businesses there. They're like, yeah, if I want to fire that person, it's going to take 6 months and then I'm going to have to pay them another year. And if I put it in motion now, I'm going to have to get all these different people involved in the government. And they were just like, I don't know, we'll just work around them. And even today, there's still some of this stuff going on. In Australia, I was recently speaking to a bunch of executives in Australia, and they told me something about they have these new laws. They're called the right to disconnect law. Yeah. And that is an employee can go to work and say, I don't want you to contact me outside of work hours. And there's legislation that gives them that right. And I think Australia should create a right to disconnect for the companies to get rid of people who sign that, who sign up for that. Because this is just ridiculous. This idea that the government needs to protect employees from these horrible companies that are going to treat them terribly. I mean, in a coal mine or in a factory in certain countries, that's probably necessary. But in most cases, a company that treats their employees that way is going to lose their best people. So I think it's good that people are like, how do we get rid of these kind of ridiculous laws and cultures that don't let us inspire people to work harder? And that is something completely different.
Well, and Pat, I think so much what you're saying is kind of core to what we talk about, which is you have to create a culture in a company. You can't legislate hunger. You can't regulate hunger. And the idea of like, one of our core values at our own organization is hunger. And the way we define it in the Ideal Team Player is it's not a level of workaholism. Like in fact, we would decline an applicant that wanted to work at the table group if their hunger showed up in sort of a identity-based desire to prove their worth. And that was like their worth was their ability to produce. That is not what we mean by hunger. And so what's so interesting is like when you talk about, a legislation that would prevent you from calling me after hours, we don't need that here because our culture is like, hey, if there's something that needs to get done, sure, of course, we should connect after hours. We should get it done. That's not, you telling me I have to work until 9 p.m. And I think that's why there's this sort of backwards way. They're trying to back their way into what they should try to proactively create in a culture, which is hunger and competitiveness. It just doesn't work that way.
And there's two, it's taken me a while to get to this today and to think about this, but hiring is one of the most important things. I mean, do not hire workaholics and do not hire slackers. And over the years, Cody, and you've talked about this, Jim Collins said, hire slow and fire fast. But hire slow means find people that really want to do a great job, and that really have a strong work ethic, but not that want to prove to everybody else that they're willing to sacrifice their personal life completely for the good of the company. And either of those extremes is a really bad thing. And I fear that what's going on in the world right now is we went from one extreme and now we're going to go to the other. And both of those are not sustainable. We want to create a model of sustainable competitiveness that allows for work-life balance, but also makes us really successful at work. And I think the word that I like and we've always believed in is flexibility. When I worked at a job where they wanted us to work 72 hours a week, we felt totally like slaves. We were like, we had to be there. We got to the point where at night we would hang our jacket on our thing, mess up our desk and keep our light on just in case people might walk by and think, wow, he's still here. That guy's a dog, I think the best way to reward hungry employees is to give them flexibility around when and how they get things done. and give them clear goals, and they will almost always exceed your expectations for their output and their productivity. It just won't come on a schedule that you determine.
Yeah, I like the word flexibility. I thought the word you were going to use is ownership. Because there's a certain level of competitiveness and ownership that goes along with hunger, which is like, hey, this is my area of responsibility. And whether it takes me 4 hours to complete or 14 hours to complete, this is my responsibility. This is what you've given me as like in my purview at work. And again, I think it goes back to, like you said, depending on who you hire, if you hire the wrong people, of course you have to legislate that, or you have to find a way, a policy, and I love the phrase when we're talking about organizational health, that the best organizations in the world institutionalize their culture without bureaucratizing it.
Right.
And I think that what we're hearing is they're trying to bureaucratize a culture that would, sort of back its way into, how do we create hunger? Well, let's make them work more. And that's just not the way that the business world works.
Yeah. The ownership thing, I do think that's the thing I would look for in hiring. When we talk about hunger, it's like, do they have a sense of ownership? Do they feel like the work they do matters in terms of, even if nobody notices, I want that customer that this is my business. This work I do really reflects on my reputation, not my self-esteem, because that can get too much. But it's like, no, it matters to me, and I'm going to go above and beyond because I care about my customer or my colleague and how this place looks to the outside world, not because I'm afraid to get fired or because somebody is forcing me to do that.
Pat, and I think there's another part of this conversation that is, we've touched on this before, is like, there is this sort of comfort crisis, thing in society where people don't want to feel discomfort. Yeah. I was even talking to my daughter last night. She's in jujitsu, and I wasn't there. My wife told me that she had like some issues with the coach, and I said, "Hey, what was going on last night?" And she's like, they were just pushing me really hard, and it was hard. And I was trying to explain, like, that's a good thing. And I think this is why I talked about it being a philosophical debate at the very beginning, is because if you don't believe that your work and your colleagues and the people who lead you at work are supposed to push you a little bit so that you can level up and become better, if the people around a leader are not getting better, and it's just like, I think that's a philosophical argument that companies are having. Like, I think you requiring more of me is not a, let's legislate that and say you can't call me after hours. It's because you see potential in people, and we believe in a world where work is where we're growing and where we can go beyond our own. If I entered the table group at a certain level of hunger, I would hope 10 years later that I'm actually more hungry because I want to grow as a human being. And that's going to come from a little bit of discomfort. And I think this war between, the right of the worker and the leader, I think if you're creating the right culture where we're coming to work to learn and grow, you don't have to say, hey, don't call me at night,
right.
And there's some people who obviously abuse that. And this is why we often talk, not to throw lawyers under the bus, is like, this is why we don't let lawyers lead companies for the same reason. Because there's one anomaly where there's a leader who's required too much or said, we're going to implement the 996 rule. And then we have to swing the pendulum to the opposite side and try to protect the employee. And there's a lot of room in the middle. Yeah,
I liked when you said about institutionalizing, but not bureaucratizing the culture. Bureaucratizing means we have a policy that says this and this and this. Institutionalizing that says we have a culture in the way we hire and how we manage people that has very high expectations for them and gives them flexibility. And I love this example because sometimes it gets down into policies. And if you work at a big company, maybe this is not, it's probably not possible. It might be though, but at a medium-sized or smaller company, it certainly is. When we started the table group, all of us were just entering into our families were going to start having kids. And I remember when Tracy went out on maternity leave, co-founder of the company, I said, people are like, what's the policy on maternity leave? And I said, whatever she needs. And they said, well, yeah, I know, and we're small. And so it was like, I'm not going to go to some other company and borrow their playbook or their policy manual. And I said, she can be gone for 4 months as far as and somebody said, oh, that would be crazy. And I said, watch what happens.
Yeah.
There's Tracy, at home a month into her maternity leave. running payroll from home. And we were like, hey, we don't want you to do that. She goes, no, this is easy. I don't mind I have a little bit of time here and I really want this to get done. See, her ownership meant that she was going to go above and beyond, but in a way that worked for her family. Whereas if I tried to predict that and give a policy that did that, that would never work. Well, and if you hire the right people, we've hired the wrong people before and put them into that world and they took advantage of it. And we realized, hey, this isn't going to work for you, is it? They're like, no, I thought I could just do the minimum. We're like, no, we give you that flexibility so that you can make good decisions. And every once in a while, you're going to find someone that wants to take advantage of that. And the exception proves the rule.
And that was the emphasis I was going to make too, Pat, is like, if you hire the right people like Tracy, you don't have to make a policy. And what ends up happening is companies get lazy around their hiring practices. They hire people who plan to take advantage of that. Somebody has a baby and is out 16 months. And then you have to say, well, the only way for us to kind of make this even and fair is to create a policy around it. And so in some ways, I think a lot of this, if you were talking to that same leader in Europe and they said, man, how do we get more competitive? Isn't the answer just hire competitive people? Like, and develop competitive people instead of, is it a 996 rule? Is it a, we can contact you after dark rule? I really do think, and we've had many conversations where this is a competitive advantage. If you're a human being that has hunger and you want to try, the market is ripe for you to get great jobs right now, because that long corporate COVID, the way people have sort of kind of slid into less effectiveness and efficiency because they've been working from home. If you have any ounce of hunger about you, there are companies all over that are just dying to hire you.
Yeah. And be explicit up front. I mean, I remember in the early days of the Table Group, we were interviewing this woman, and the first question she asked was time off. And that's before about the job, about what she was going to do. And we were like, oh, she's like, I want to protect. Other people were like, I'm really excited about this. And then I felt like, okay, it's my job to make sure they don't burn themselves out or sacrifice their family. So I hired a person with a high engine, and then my job got to be like, I want to encourage them to have balance. Man, I tell you what, running a company like that is so much more joyful than bringing a bunch of people in and trying to constantly crank them up to try harder. So it's true. It really does come to hire the right people, turn them loose, give them flexibility and ownership. You are going to be competitive. And when you make a mistake, fix it quickly and do not back off, because just because somebody tried to take advantage of it doesn't mean it's not the right thing for everybody else.
Yeah, I like the hunger wins topic. It's true. Hunger will win. Not policies, not procedure, not work hours, but hunger.
Yeah. And if you're going to be a leader in that company, you have to have that hunger and that sense of ownership too. All righty. That's it today. Thanks, Cody. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you too.
We'll talk to you next time. We'll talk to everybody next time on the At the Table podcast. God bless.